what are the priorities of the Ukrainian government and how the rest of the world can best support it to the extent that they are willing to do so. And as we know, some countries are and some countries are not. I do want to say here that the fact that you would join Chatham House members and guests is a testament to the importance that I think you attach to the importance of getting Ukraine's message out to as many audiences as possible. And it has become such an important part of this war to be able to understand what is taking place and to understand real time from you and your government what is taking place. I'd say that Chatham House members, as you may know, come from all over the world, not just the UK, and they come from all walks of life. And they are a manifestation of the vibrant civil society that I know that you and your government and your predecessors have been cultivating in Ukraine since it became an independent democratic state in 1991. Chatham House has been a strong supporter of a successful Ukraine. I like to say that we try to be critical friends. And my colleague, Orysia Lutsevich, who runs the Ukraine Forum since 2015, has had the privilege of working with many Ukrainian leaders in civil society, in politics, to that end. So on her behalf and on behalf of all of my colleagues at Chatham House, we welcome you to this online event. Let me quickly explain the format. I don't want to take too long. In a minute, President Zelensky will offer some opening remarks. We will then move to Q&A. I will ask some questions, but you, our members, also have an opportunity to ask questions. But please do so through the Q&A function. We will not be using chat. We will not be using raise hand. So put them in the Q&A. I will ask the questions. It's simpler. We have a translation. Hopefully, those of you who joined, you have the choice of Ukrainian or English. Please go down to the interpretation button and make your choice, and you can then participate in the meeting that way. And finally, I would simply say that this is on the record. For all of you who are here, please do feel free to use the social media and be able to enjoy it that way. Volodymyr Zelensky was elected the 6th president of Ukraine in April 2019. He won a large majority, over 73% in the second round against former President Petro Poroshenko, sworn in on the 20th of May. His party won a landslide election, became the first majority party in the Ukrainian parliament since its independence. As I think many of you know, and I'm not going to say too much about Volodymyr Zelensky's background, but I think one of the important things to know is that he got his law degree from Kiev National Economic University. Started there, but as everyone here knows, went into a very successful career in TV, film, and in comedy. And I suppose there is something quite unreal in a way, Mr. President, going from playing the role of president in Servant of the People through to 2019, from 2015-19 to becoming president. But nothing could be further from comedy. Nothing could be further from the lighthearted nature of entertainment than the absolutely brutal reality of what is happening to Ukraine right now since it was invaded, and the leadership role that you are having to play, and if I may say at the outset, playing exceedingly well. We look forward to your remarks. We look forward to engaging in conversation. Thank you for joining us. Over to you, President Zelensky.
Thank you very much, Robin. I would like to say that it is a great honor for me to be invited. Thank you for the background notes. My life is really interesting. It is not coming to its end, I believe. I believe that there is a bright future still ahead of us, and it is too soon that we make any conclusions from this background. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, dear friends and guests of Chatham House for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And I'm thankful for Chatham House being one of the most influential hubs. Back in 2015, you created a special program as a critical friend of Ukraine for in-depth studies of the Ukrainian context, I believe. And those studies help us find answers to some very topical questions. And I would like to put some questions to you before you reciprocate. This is a dialogue, but I'm sure that every one of you understand very well what kind of scope of problems we are talking about after the Russian full-fledged invasion. This is of utmost priority, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world, not just for our people, but all the peoples in this continent and in the world. I'm absolutely certain. This is the full scope incursion, one of the remnants of the bad old times of the 18th century, perhaps. Some challenges, the cruelty of the Russian force, of the people who invaded Ukraine, and their great despise expressed as regards all the international covenants and conventions, human rights. That's what is most important for me, the integrity of our borders and the states in Europe as such. Why Russia is doing that, I wonder? Well, because they believe that their responsibility can be postponed for decades, if it ever comes. And they do not believe that they can be made responsible for the war crimes because they have the power of the nuclear state and the nuclear blackmail. After many decades, we can see this put bluntly by the Russian propaganda mongers. They are calculating how much time is needed for a nuclear missile to hit the European capitals. They are talking about that openly, how they can make a nuclear blast in the ocean to wash away the British Isles. And with the infographics, they boast of Russia being capable of turning any state into nuclear ashes. That's what they say, literally, nuclear ashes. Why is this happening? Well, we are convinced that this is the feeling of impunity. They believe that business as usual would always come back to the relations between Russia and European countries. There are some politicians in Europe still which are not ashamed of their relations after all Russia did in Europe has done. And the political chaos and scores of countries can be instigated because of the foodstuffs crisis. They blackmail Europe to, first they wanted to launch the Nord Stream 2. That was a crisis, energy crisis in Europe, and they were purposefully not providing enough gas, and the gas prices hit the ceiling, the historic ceiling, the historic cap back then. And that was to the detriment of all the European countries' situations. Now we have our seaports being blocked by Russia. They captured them, some of them, and the global market suffers because of the lack of supplies of some key food products, grain, sunflower oil, maize, and other agricultural types of produce. And we can see the results of that, but I'm sure that we do not see it yet because there is enough analysis to see the full picture. We'll see that. There's some the deficit in sunflower oil. The agricultural business is being now undermined by the lack of our supplies, and the basic foodstuffs are lacking in some countries already. This is the pressure for the prices to rise in North Africa, Middle East, and some Asian countries, and then that will gradually cover other regions of the world. The neediest will suffer. The people with the lowest income and the middle class, because the political repercussions of that can be dangerous, and that's what I'm saying, and that's what they are calling, they call a political chaos. the foodstuffs deficit, the food security. So, dear audience, the Russian war against our country that looked like a bilateral affair. For some people, they would smile at that and say that that was a kind of incursion, a kind of special military operation in Russian terms. Now the picture is seen differently, in a more serious fashion, but this is the second day of the full-fledged war, and we can see no end of it yet. And we cannot feel any willingness of the Russian side to end it. And we cannot have satisfactory answers to the challenges presented by Russia. Starting from the 24th of February, there haven't been any single day when we wouldn't have any negotiations with our team to get the necessary military equipment and to accommodate the sanctions against Russia, to arrange for the necessary cooperation to document and investigate all the war crimes. We haven't seen a single day without some siege of Mariupol by the Russian force, one of the examples, mind you. And every day we would try to look for some diplomatic solutions for saving people and arranging for the humanitarian corridors to accomplish that. We are in contact with all the influential parties there. We are already preparing the big plan of reconstruction for Ukraine, because we are absolutely certain that we will defend our independence and regain that territory, and we believe in power of the world. This is not believing in miracles, working miracles for that matter. From reason, pure reason, we can say that the response of the world to such an aggression should be instantaneous. And in fact, it takes months for us to discuss the same things over and over again. For example, the oil embargo against Russia, blocking of all the banking sector for the terrorist state, and supplies of weapons, military equipment for Ukraine to defend itself. And I'm very grateful to the countries which are helping us from the very first days on an everyday basis. And for them, it is clear what the real scope of this threat is. But some countries underestimate it. For the most part, the challenges posed by Russia have not yet received adequate responses. We have to continuously look for the new toolkit, the new determination to stop not just Russia, but any potential aggressor. Russia is the aggressor, and Ukraine suggested United 24, the U-24 arrangement to update the global security system for us to be able to prevent, or at least to respond within 24 hours to any kind of aggression, or within 24 hours to provide any kind of assistance for the victim of that aggression and to restore peace, or any kind of man-made or natural catastrophe to get a response in this way, so that the community would provide for the country in question all the necessary assistance to save people. And thanks to such a global system of response, we can guarantee that it will never happen again when millions of people are under threat of physical destruction or forced deportation or starvation, any kind of destruction. So these are the issues that should be now met with answers from politicians, from experts, from the societies in question. And I would like to put some questions to you now. What can be done for the responsibility for war crimes to come not in decades, but to be almost immediate, like with the usual criminal investigation and adjudication? And what kind of sanctions can be convincing enough for Russia and any kind of aggressor to prove to them that they have to respect the international law. What global solutions do we need to control the weapons of mass destructions and to prevent any kind of attempt to use it, and blackmailing with it? And so that no aggressor can even mention such an option. And what kind of sanctions should we impose in response to the blackmailing with nuclear weapons or chemical weapons for that matter? What can convince the politicians of the world to make those issues practical, not just discussable? And I suppose you will offer some opinions, contribute some answers to my questions. This is your experience, this is your expertise, because the answers we all need. The world needs your answers. Every person watching us now, and the people who will watch us, and people who try to answer these questions every day. And you can contribute to the U24 arrangement that we suggested as an option. This is our initiative. The more initiatives we have, the more people will realize the global scope of such challenges and the global scope of the answers that should be supplied. Thank you very much. Glory be to Ukraine.
Thank you very much, President Zelensky, and for laying out your thinking of where you are at the moment. I could say thank you for asking me some questions, or us some questions. I fear that if we turn this into a more typical Chatham House type of seminar, then my members would be very upset with me because they would listen to us talking and not you talking. And perhaps what we can do is, with my colleagues, is actually write you a little note after this with some very specific answers. I will simply say three very quick things. How do you avoid nuclear blackmail? You don't accept it. And I think this is some of the language that we're hearing from NATO leaders in particular right now, is not to accept the threat. How do you make sure that this kind of aggression is not treated with impunity? I think you need to look at this as a war of aggression, not simply the conduct of human rights, appalling abuses and war crimes. Without the war itself, you wouldn't have the war crime. And Chatham House has hosted a number of meetings about the concept of this being a war of aggression and how that could be then punished in court. But I think, sadly, quick justice in international law is extremely rare. So in any case, I'm not going to say any more and use up time, but you ask extremely pertinent questions, and I think you deserve answers. We'll provide some additional ones to you, if I could say, later on. If I may just ask you one opening question from myself, and I will simply say to our members, we have 160 questions there, which we're obviously not going to get through. What I would say is, please read the questions, because actually members of Chatham House tend to ask very good questions. So you will find a fascinating set of perspectives just by reading through them. And also, if you think any are especially good, you can upvote them. Click on the little thumbs up and they will go to the top of the sheet. And then I can go to those first and make sure that some of the most popular questions are asked. It will help me do my job. President Zelensky, just one question that maybe is a broad one. It didn't touch on what you said, but much of the world, I think, was surprised by the resistance that the Ukrainian people have presented to the invasion by Russian forces. I want to ask you, were you surprised that Russians in Kherson, in Kharkiv, in Donbass, that they have given their lives, that they've been, that mayors of small villages, mayors of towns, who are often thought as being the people that the Russian forces could turn maybe to their advantage, have you been surprised by how united Ukrainians have been in the face of this conflict? That's my first question.
Was I surprised? And the nation that we have, I am pleased to have another opportunity to answer such a question, because it is always pleasant to talk about things you know very well. And I am a living witness of how our people responded to that aggression from Russia. I just can issue two signals. This is a dialogue, so I would like to respond to what you said about the nuclear blackmail. You said that is unacceptable, just like that. And it is my idea, maybe it's a rhetorical one, but we do not accept terrorism, right? Nobody in this audience accepts terrorism, and we do not talk to terrorists, right? Any kind of terrorist, but nevertheless, they exist. They do exist as a phenomenon, and they act and they live on. So I'm not criticizing your points. I would like to share my opinion from my experience and from what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening to Ukraine. And people are all concerned here because the nuclear weapon is being wielded by some power. We do not accept this, but can this lack of acceptance stop the blackmail? I'm not sure. But speaking of war crimes, why I put that question, I fully agree with you, Robin, that this is a long way when it comes to the international law and adjudication. But the ideology, the philosophy of responsibility or liability in such crimes doesn't work. This is my impression, and as a citizen, I offer it. We are a collective witness of war crimes. I witness war crimes in our country. And MH17, do you remember that flight? 8 years have elapsed. But what happened? What's the result? Is there any relief for the people who lost their loved ones? No, that side, they hate all the world. Any kind of adjudication they despise and resent, and they hate. I've seen those people, they hate life as such. And every time, every year, they hate more and more. So their crimes become more and more horrible, and there is no end to this process. So that's why I'm suggesting that we should rethink the structure of the international law in that respect. Let me say, answering your question, well, perhaps I can tell you the final truth after the end of this war. I feel that at this stage, my answer cannot be yet adequate, because at first we wanted to unite, to be strong together and stand up to the threat. And that was the fist of our people, clenched and hitting back the Russian military equipment or whatever. They were using the military apparatus they were using against us. And people, barehanded sometimes, in different ways, were trying to stop the equipment in the country roads to arrest their progress, even barehanded. But I've always been convinced that our people are strong. But I want to be fair there. I think that citizens, I do not wish that any of your countries have a test, but if you have such an invasion, I think we cannot be sure that all the people, I'm convinced that all the adequate people would try to defend their country, their families, their households. So I think normal people think along those lines, naturally, just naturally. And I am just happy that we have such a number of normal, strong people, responsible people as our citizens. And I am also surprised with their bravery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I think the bravery is being witnessed by people around the world on a daily basis and is hugely inspiring. Let me just move on, if I may, to a second question. You have focused yourself very heavily on the specific conflict in Mariupol, the attempted invasion and now the siege of the Azovstal steelworks. Let me ask you a sort of two-sided question. Is there anything that can stop Russia from taking Mariupol? This is a question from Jill Lawless at the Associated Press. Her question was, is there anything that could stop Russia from taking the last parts of Mariupol? And my question added to that is, if the Russians do take Mariupol fully, how does this change the shape of the war? Does it change the shape of the war? Or in a way, have Ukrainian fighters already won a type of victory? Could you say something about Mariupol, please?
Я в кінці не зрозумів, може через переклад.
A question back to me, because if it was, it wasn't translated.
No, I complimented. So let me start answering your question with the first part, the former part. Then the latter part will clarify. But I would like to clarify some details there. Speaking of Mariupol, one of the most complicated points of this war, this is an example of torture, of blockade and torture with starvation. Nobody can get any kind of foodstuffs. Nobody can get the foodstuffs there. All the international organizations are prohibited from entering the area. They cannot supply water. Not just Ukrainian organizations, and they cannot provide, they just occupy it. And for some people who are not blocked at Azovstal, they provided some food for them, allegedly, but people first would refuse any kind of supply from the Russians, and people would drink from the pools. Some terrible examples of that because of their terrible thirst. And this is a beastly attitude. Anyone would agree. It's not human. But that's the topicality of the issues. That's the attitude. That's attitudinal. That's how the military, the Russian military, treats people. That's inhuman treatment of humankind as a kind. And that strikes anyone. The cruelty, the sheer cruelty, the sheer degrading and torture. So death is not caused by war. This is not a military event. This is torturing to death. This is terrorism and hatred. And we can discuss it in more detail, why this is happening. You said 160 questions, and I was scared, quite frankly. So I'm now reluctant to give long answers to any kind of question. But let me discuss those people who are responsible for this inhuman and degrading treatment, the torture. It's not the military. The military, of course, will be made liable. There will be a tribunal, I believe, for the killing, for the death, for the torture. But why this cruelty? That's the information apparatus. They are responsible. They developed this hatred and heated it to such an extent before the full-fledged war was waged against Ukraine. It took years preceding the incursion. And now we have torture. So starting as a good neighbor with some common history and families which are mixed, Russian-Ukrainian, Ukrainian-Russian on both sides. So we had relations because we are neighbors geographically. So that ended up in torture. And the information apparatus, I think Goebbels is a child in comparison with the adults in the Kremlin. And This is the scariest thing. That's what we learn from this war. This is the most hideous thing done by a human being without any shots, just with the information machine hunting a nation, a whole nation, and preparing the groundwork, because we have 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and the beginning was 8 years ago. So then they were 10 to 12 years old. They were adolescents, teenagers. So we are talking about schooling, about universities, about vocational training. This is a big propaganda machine. That's what has been done. And I think this is something we have to deal with in this situation, because you can torture, and then this torture can be adjudicated, but you cannot wash the brains, because that's a big problem. It's a big problem of cleansing of the residue of this propaganda. And for Mariupol, this is a big problem. This is a big national problem, this degrading treatment. Mariupol can be deblocked. It could be deblocked any day with the necessary equipment, full stop. There is no other option to deblock it. Presently, everything is in the situation when, because of our efforts, the Red Cross, the United Nations, somehow we found that format to evacuate people from the blocked Azov facility, the peaceful people. Peaceful people were walking around and they could be killed by any shell. So they were hunting humans, the military and civilian alike. This is a terrible story. It will be told in proper fashion, I'm sure. Yes, please, Robin.
Just the second part of that question. I know this is so important, and I hate having to break it, but I just wanted to ask specifically, if Mariupol falls,
Ні, так краще, так, будь ласка.
What do you think?
Can you repeat this question? Because
yes, please. Sorry, if Mariupol falls, does this change the shape of the conflict? Does this potentially release, in your opinion, Russian forces to move north? Is it critical that you and those brave fighters hang on, or have you already thought what the consequences would be if it falls?
Ви повинні знати.
You should understand that Mariupol will never fall. I'm not talking about heroism or anything. The fighters, the army that we have, but there is nothing there to fall apart. It is already devastated. There is no place. There is no structure. It is all destroyed completely. And there is this little turf, this little structure, the Azov steel, the steel mill, or what remains of it. And people are being evacuated as much as we can. And I understand that Russia would like to have a parade for the Victory Day, the 9th of May, and so forth. This is a follow-up to this INFOPS and PSYCOPS machine, and PSYOPS and INFOPS machine. It's there. A fair, though it affects us, but it only weapons could have deblocked or will deblock this region, this area, when and if we have the necessary equipment. And if they kill people who can be exchanged as POWs or just released as civilians or be helped as wounded or injured, civilian and military alike, if they destroy them, I don't think we can have any diplomatic talks with them after that. But speaking in the military sense, they will proceed till the point when we stop them. And they will enter the areas which will be made available for them by us and the world, because the world is supposed to serve as a war, but not as a war between Ukraine and the Western world, the war between us and the Russian universe. And that's what is important in this situation.
Thank you very much for that. Let me, if I may, turn to another question from Frank Gardner at the BBC. And I think it's a question that's reflected through many of the questions here that we've had today. It's the following one. What is the minimum that you, the Ukrainian people, but you, the president on their behalf, could accept in a peace deal with Russia? Could you accept a return to where things were on February 23rd?
First of all, I would like us to understand that I was elected by the people of Ukraine as president of Ukraine, not as president of a mini Ukraine of some kind. And this is a very important point. And I would like us to realize we need some arrangements in terms of talks to stop the killing, so we can use diplomatic channels to regain also our territories. The minimum I would accept. I think the minimal step before we stop the war, it is there. The minimum is for us to start talking, using this notional normality, if it fits the situation, but to deblock the diplomatic format of our relations, to stop the war between Russia and Ukraine. This step should be regaining the situation as of the 23rd of February. You are right. They have to fall back and go beyond the contact lines, and they should withdraw the troops, of course. In that situation, we'll be able to start discussing things normally. But for them to withdraw, they have to say something, and we have to start talking. And I realized that despite the fact that they destroying all our bridges, I think not all the bridges are yet destroyed, figuratively speaking.
Well, that's a very important statement you just made there, because after the horrors of Bucha, Mariupol, of all the war crimes we discussed at the beginning, that is an important point you made about not having all bridges destroyed. In that context, let me ask you a question that brings a little bit the role of allies into it. We have both the United States administration, the Biden administration, and the British government in particular, talking about victory. Victory must involve the defeat of Vladimir Putin, even that it must involve all Russian forces leaving all of territorial Ukraine. So my question to you, Mr. President, is it helpful to have some of your key backers diplomatically and militarily setting that war aim publicly at this time? Is that helpful to you as President of Ukraine or not?
Well, it's a very complicated question. I am not afraid of such blunt statements. I think the more direct, the better. The easier for Ukraine and for the Ukrainian society and for the Russian society, for that matter, for them to understand that if we don't stop this, let's come back to the allegoric situation, then all the bridges will be burned. So we have to be open discussing that. If there is bilateral war, we cannot, we can discuss this without any allegories. We diplomatically can only discuss the specific steps. So what victory is for us as a nation, for the European Union, what that is for the UK, for the US. For some people, it may be Putin's defeat. And in our society, there is a big proportion of people thinking exactly that. But for me, the victory, I do not care what happens to some leaders and where they will end up. For me, what matters is Ukraine's victory. And by Ukraine's victory, we mean something that belongs to us. This is our territory and our people. For me, victory is not to lose 11 million people, 5 million people who left Ukraine. They have to come back. That's my victory. I'm thinking about it because for me, victory is at least bringing the country back economically, at least to the situation when it all started, as a good beginning, but also for the Western world to have complete awareness of what is happening here and what the pain is like. They should feel our pain. That will unite them, and they will never be affected by any Russian propaganda, and they will be helping us all the way. And for us, for me, victory is admission and accession to the European Union with all the pros and cons. And when we discuss that, and that's the will of the Ukrainian people. And this all started in the Maidan. We've had the revolutions to that effect. And this war is also about that. This cannot be in vain. So Ukraine in the EU is not the principal, the major victory, but we cannot just disregard the people who sacrificed their lives for that. So it's the dream, it's the will, and the steps that we've made, and that's what we intend to do as a nation. And if somebody from Europe, even now, they already have received our refugees, they've seen all the footage in the world, they've listened to me, to us, they're listening now, and they realize what is happening here. In Mariupol, people are dying in thousands, but there are still some persons who want to get some oxygen without even attempting to breathe. And they want to strike the balance. They want to be in the gray area, stay in the shadow. Well, as some people say, that's walking in between the drops of rain. And this is not a rain. It's never rains, it pours, you know, as the saying goes. And this is the war of water, and there are no drops anymore. We're all wet by now, soaking wet. And this is cynicism. This is the lack of adequacy in some leaders, in some developed countries. And the adequacy of the world is also a victory for Ukraine. That will influence us. It does influence us already. And what will happen to some individuals in Russia, why should I think about the other side, their military, their leader, their president, and what will happen to them, their destiny? They should be punished for what they did. That's the most important thing in my book, according to the international law. But if they come here and even fail to collect their dead, and they do not care about their quick, and why should I care? It's their affair. I have to think about my people, my citizens.
I understand. Thank you, Mr. President. Can I ask you a question? Because we have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm doing my best to run through them. But
Я дуже довго відповідаю, Робіне, я зрозумів.
I'm giving you too long answers, that's why.
They're important answers, but they're good. But as I said, I don't want to frighten you by how many questions we have. I'm picking up the main ones. If I could ask the question about sanctions, there are quite a few questions about what it is that are you getting what you want from your NATO European partners in particular. But could you say, are you satisfied with the support you're getting, in particular from EU nations? And let me include Germany. There is a very specific question that's right at the top of the list of the 230 questions. You'll be interested, maybe surprised to know that the question at the top of the 230 questions is what would you say to President Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, I should say, if you had the opportunity to meet with him? What would you discuss with Chancellor Scholz? And I think underneath that question is the whole issue of the kinds of sanctions, the energy sanctions they're imposing. Are you getting what you expected? Are you happy with what you're getting? The EU has provided 1.5 billion euros of funding for military support. You could never have imagined that 3 months ago. But I'm wondering whether it's enough from your perspective as President Zelensky. And obviously, you chose not to let President Steinmeier, the president of Germany, or at least you're not interested in his visit, which makes it difficult, I think, for Chancellor Scholz to visit. But what would you ask from Chancellor Scholz? Could you just say something about where we are on your attitudes and your relationship with the EU and the sanctions they've been doing?
Дивіться, що стосується санкцій. Я вважаю найголовніше...
Speaking of these sanctions, I think that in any kind of steps, there are steps in favor or against, and they should be transparent and honest. And then again, you cannot be slightly evil and slightly good. With the right hand, you impose sanctions. With the left hand, you sign the Russian contracts. This is not true, right. This is hypocrisy. The sanctions should be so effective that we will never have to revisit that. Like SWIFT against the banking system, the cutoff. If you're against any financial deals, you have to cut them off, cut the banking system of the Russian Federation.
Тут ми можемо, а це ми не можемо.
Because we can do some things with some banks and cannot do that with some other banks. This country, but not that country. And what Germany will say, what Hungary will say, look, we have to look the truth straight in the eye. This is hypocrisy, and this is what I can say about the sanctions. In generally speaking, with the EU, the UK, the US, at last we have the sanction policy, a sanction policy. It used to be erroneous, and there was no preventive set of sanctions. Nobody took heed of our pledges, but now we would not have had this situation had we sanctioned them in advance, and the sanctions would have been effective by now. So I think that was a mistake. We are very grateful to the community for the sanctions that we have now. You know, the energy resources, that Russia makes 1 billion a day in Europe on the energy resources. How can we argue that, let's postpone, let's delay in 4 months, in a year? It's a dangerous game. If you realize that you cannot do without this resource, just say so, that in 2 months you will stop that. No exceptions for some jurisdictions. It should be all done in unity, solidarity. That's togetherness of the European Union. This is the essence of this notion of union. We are not in that union, but union is about unity. We are not a member, but we understand what unity is, unlike some countries who have been with the union for many years. So the energy resources will end up being cancelled altogether with the embargo. It will be difficult, but it will be difficult in your countries, and all your families will live on, unlike some our families. But if you fail to do that, you will realize when they are at your border, and with the first missile impact, like we felt when the missiles take away the limbs of children and adults, you will understand that Nord Stream 2 or 3, even Nord Stream 100, they are not worth anybody's health and life, and it knocks at your door, and unless you open, you wouldn't believe it. And they will family aside and burn your household. That's the situation that we are facing here. For Europe even, speaking of Russia, everything they are arguing about, they do partially or completely. All the threats they make come true. If they say that we'll be back to Berlin, to Germany, that's their dream. If the EU is undermined and Ukraine falls, God forbid, they will come in generation and years, but they will come back to you, and they will make all their words come true, however shameful. Speaking of Olaf Scholz, I think Chancellor Scholz, for him, we need, he's invited. The invitation is open. It's been for some time now. He's invited to come to Ukraine. He can make this very powerful political step to come here on the 9th of May to Kiev. I am not explaining the significance. I think you are cultured enough to understand why. But sometimes in history we have to make certain steps for unity, even if there is some kind of coldness in specific relations. But yesterday I talked to President Steinmeier, and I invited him and passed my invitation to the Chancellor through him. Ukraine is open, and especially in this war, we have no doors to open, we're just open. You can come anytime. And speaking of the sanctions, generally speaking, it's my vision that if the Iron Curtain, which Russia is drawing now, gradually by steadily, like the Soviet Union before them, we should not interrupt, we should not interfere. It's their affair. They will remove the Iron Curtain, one of the next generations, when they get all the consequences of that curtain that they are drawing with their own bloody hands and their information policy. If this is an Iron Curtain, there cannot be any export import business with Russia unless they stop blackmailing us with the nuclear weapons and the chemical weapons, for all the world occupation of other countries where they once had their garrisons in the Soviet times, and killings in our territories, when this is all stopped, when their brains are clear, when all the world is free from fear and fearing their threats, will use all the necessary equipment to remove the Iron Curtain.
Mr. President, if we have time, because I know we're on the hour, if I could ask you one last question.
Please. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's a very important one. You talked about the sense of impunity that you believe Vladimir Putin has, that he can do what he wants. There are only 39 countries, by my count, imposing sanctions right now. So even if he draws the bloody curtain, or the curtain with his bloody hand across the middle of Europe, he still seems to have plenty of open doors down, whether to India or to China or to many, many other countries in Africa, many democracies that are willing to continue trading and who see this conflict and the rising food prices and all of the stuff you talked about before as actually somehow being the fault of Ukraine and Russia and NATO. And it's like this old Cold War from the last century. How do you connect with them? How do you make them understand that this is also, the rise in that price is not your fault, it's not NATO's fault. This is a choice made in the Kremlin, made by Vladimir Putin. How are you connecting to that much bigger community? If you want justice, more of the world has to feel the injustice. And at the moment, sadly, the world is quite divided on this. What can you do about that?
Well, for the world to hear, we have to keep talking to them and providing them, supplying them with examples, with the evidence, because Europe and the Western world is united around Ukraine. Not all the world, mind you. And we admit that, and we are quite outspoken with you, with the journalists and all the media platforms and the venues. We have enough publicity now to be heard, for the voice of Ukraine to be audible for the world. What is lacking there is the energy on the part of some leaders. They should understand that this war is not taking place in Ukraine. I'm fighting for Ukraine because I'm president of Ukraine, and every president would do the same in my shoes. We have to be vocal to be able to say that, yes, I fought, visibly fought, and that's why the war never happened to my country. Because I was making efforts, and now we are dying with Ukrainians there, on their battlefield, and every leader should realize that. And then I can continue not as a soloist, but with a choir of the leaders, powerful leaders who by all means will be able to spread the word, the important word, and the energy for the societies of the countries which are not yet fully aware, which are not supporting yet our policy or joint policy of the civilized Europe. And I'm not saying that anybody is not civilized in this world, but they are not yet certain. They have not yet ascertained the way they should choose. And we should be certain that we spread the message, and the certainty with the message much better. Sorry, I was looking for a word. Contaminate. We have to engage them, perhaps is a better word. And this is more contagious than COVID-19. The spirit that we have. And we have to invest all our efforts, and we have to be exhausted with effort. And every morning we have to wake up and ask ourselves, what have I done for Ukraine? because this is the question for a leader, for a true leader, to ask oneself. It's about Ukraine, but it is essentially about your own country. And like the common people who just come to take to the streets with our banners, with our colors flying, this will be our joint victory. Not over Putin, mind you, but over this terror and terrorism that is spread. And himself and the military, the troops that they have, this is just the facade of this big war waged against humanity. So this is about uniting humankind around this idea. Because I realized that the press, for example, and the media, as we call them now, they cannot talk every day about Ukraine. After a month, they think about some other hooks, and they need the views, they have to maintain the circulation, or whatever the measurement is for their popularity. But the topic can gradually leave the stage and makes it exit. But this is a big mistake. That's the big mistake. They should realize that on an everyday basis, it should be on the front pages. What is happening in their states? They should also discuss things happening in Ukraine, because in Ukraine we have this war, and this war is our joint effort and joint victory, because that's what we share. In fact, that's my opinion.
Thank you very much, President Zelensky. I think we must wrap this up. If I may just say 4 very quick closing things to you and to our guests here who've stayed on this call, a very large number of our members. Number one, speaking to you and hearing you today, it feels like I'm looking at a time warp back to 1939 and 1940, and we're speaking to one of the leaders who was having to fight some of the horrors of that era. And it is remarkable that we are living in this dual world right now. Shocking, but I find your explanations, but your sensitivity to the human aspects of what is happening here and the way people's minds have been turned and manipulated, especially important, because manipulation of individuals was one of the features of the 1930s, the early 1930s, not just the late 1930s. So I thought that was very important. That's number one. Number two, we had one of our members asked the question, what can individuals do beyond giving money? What can individuals do, not governments? You haven't got time to answer that question, but I would simply say that being informed, making sure that the stakes are shared amongst our communities and spread beyond the 1,500 people or so on this call to so many others, and especially to the people outside the 39 countries. That is going to be incredibly important, because at the moment, not enough of the world understands the stakes. It is a northern conflict. And I want to say, thirdly, that Chatham House will continue to play its part in this role through our Ukraine Forum, but more broadly, through our engagement, through all of our work. And your talk today has been inspirational to us in that sense. So we appreciate very much your time. And that lets me say the last thing, which is that in your long life, we look forward to welcoming you to Chatham House and St. James's Square in more peaceful times, and hopefully times that have lived up to the values that you've described to us today, and that they are victorious. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you, members. And I'm afraid I gave up entirely trying to keep track of the questions. I saw the rough gist of them. Hopefully I captured enough of them. But 255 questions is definitely a record. And I know you answered the bulk of them, President Zelensky, without reading them. So that was good.